The night should have been filled with celebration, but instead the house carried a heavy silence. The glow of wedding photographs still lingered on the mantelpiece. Emily, in her white dress, smiling softly. David standing tall beside her, his arm firm around her waist. To friends and neighbors, they were the portrait of happiness. But behind the walls of their home, shadows crept into every corner. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her veil tossed carelessly onto the floor. Her eyes, red from tears, avoided David's. He paced the room, muttering to himself, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle beneath his cheek twitched. "You couldn't have waited?" His voice was sharp, breaking the silence like glass. Emily looked up at him, exhausted. "Waited for what, David? For you to finally tell me the truth? For you to stop hiding everything from me?" The argument had started hours earlier, but neither of them could let go. The night that should have been the beginning of their future had become a battlefield of old wounds. Beneath Emily's calm exterior simmered suspicion. Beneath David's restraint boiled desperation. "You think I don't know?" she whispered. "The late nights, the money disappearing, the lies you feed me like I'm too naive to notice." David stopped pacing. His stare was cold, but his silence said more than words ever could. Emily's voice cracked. "I didn't marry a stranger, but lately you feel like one." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, filling the gap where his response should have been. Finally, he said, "You don't understand what I'm dealing with. You never have." The tension hung thick. In that moment, they were no longer husband and wife, but enemies caught in a fragile truce that could collapse at any second. Emily turned away, her shoulders shaking, and David's face twisted with something darker than anger, something closer to fear. By midnight, yet the house had grown eerily quiet. The argument fizzled, not because the wounds had healed, but because exhaustion had drained them both. David went downstairs, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Emily remained in the bedroom, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Outside, the wind rattled the trees in the backyard. A dog barked in the distance, and then silence reclaimed the night. Hours later, when dawn crept across the curtains, Emily was gone. Her side of the bed was empty, the sheets still warm. Her wedding dress, now wrinkled and stained with tears, lay in the corner. The front door was locked from the inside, and her phone remained on the nightstand. No suitcase, no note, no trace of where she might have gone. David sat in the kitchen, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he hadn't touched. His expression was unreadable, too calm for a man whose wife had vanished hours after their vows. When a neighbor later asked if everything was all right, he forced a smile. "She just needed space," he said. But the words rang hollow. The silence inside the house was heavier than before, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the fight, the lies, the unspeakable dread that hung in the air. David's eyes lingered on the backyard through the window. The soil, dark and damp from last night's rain, glistened under the pale morning light. His fingers drummed against the table, slow and deliberate. Something unspoken pressed between his ribs, a secret he wasn't ready to confess. Emily had vanished, and David wasn't in a hurry to explain why. The silence of that wedding night was only the beginning. The morning after Emily's disappearance, David's world should have looked fractured. A husband newly married and already abandoned should have carried panic in his eyes, desperation in his tone. But David wore a mask so carefully constructed, it unsettled those who came near him. The phone rang before sunrise. Claire, Emily's younger sister. Her voice cracked with worry. "David? I've been trying Emily all night. Why isn't she picking up?" David's reply came smooth, steady, and unconvincing in its composure. "She needed space. We argued, that's all. She'll be back once she cools down." But Claire knew her sister. Emily didn't just disappear. She pressed further, asking if David had seen her leave, if she'd taken her phone, if there had been a note. David's answers were clipped, rehearsed, like lines from a play he had already memorized. "I don't understand why you're so calm," Claire finally said. "If it were me, I'd be tearing the city apart." David ended the call quickly. By mid-morning, the neighbors noticed Emily's absence as well. One, Mrs. Harris, saw David pacing near the porch with his coffee cup. She offered a polite smile before asking, "Is Emily all right? Haven't seen her today." David's lips curled slightly. "She needed some air, that's all. She'll be fine." His tone was casual, almost dismissive, as though Emily's vanishing was nothing more than a late errand. Yet the more he insisted everything was normal, the more abnormal it all seemed. The community, used to Emily's warmth and easy greetings, began whispering. That evening, Claire arrived at the house. She stepped inside, her eyes darting across the untouched living room. The air smelled faintly of soil and damp earth, though David brushed it off as the rain coming in through the windows. "Where is she?" Claire demanded. David looked her square in the eye, his expression void of panic. "She left." "People leave, Claire. Maybe she realized marriage wasn't what she wanted." Claire's breath caught. The calmness in his voice wasn't reassuring. It was terrifying. His indifference didn't feel human. It felt calculated, as if her sister's disappearance had lifted a burden from him rather than placed one upon his shoulders. She stormed out, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her phone to call the police. From the window, David watched her go, his face expressionless. Yet the stillness in his eyes masked a memory he couldn't erase. The sound of muffled cries in the darkness, the weight of soil pressed down by his own hands. Behind his calm exterior, the sinister truth pulsed like a second heartbeat. He had buried it deep, believing no one would ever find it. That night, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. The neighbors noted how David returned to his routines, watering plants, checking the mail, adjusting the blinds. His life carried on without the frantic chaos that should have come from losing a wife. But when the world around him began to whisper louder, Claire's growing suspicion, the neighbors' unease, David knew his calm was both his shield and his greatest risk. Too calm, and someone would see through him. Too shaken, and he would draw suspicion sooner. In his mind, the plan had been perfect. The argument had given him the excuse. The night had given him cover. And the backyard had given him silence. He whispered to himself as he shut the blinds, "She's gone, she won't be coming back." But 3 days later, that belief would be shattered. David had whispered it to himself the night before, as though repeating the words could make them true. "She's gone. She won't be coming back." But memory has a way of clawing through calm, and in the stillness of his kitchen, the images replayed as vivid as the soil beneath his fingernails. It had begun after midnight. The house was suffocating with silence, Emily's absence like a weight pressing down on every corner. David moved through the rooms like a man possessed, glancing back at the bedroom door where she had last stood alive and trembling. His mind echoed with her words, accusations of lies, betrayal, and secrets he had spent years burying in silence. When the clock struck 1, he slipped out the back door, shovel in hand. The moon hung low, pale and watchful, bathing the yard in silver light. The damp air carried the scent of earth and rain. He told himself this was necessary, that sometimes love curdles into something unrecognizable, something that demanded silence at any cost. The shovel pierced the ground with a dull thud. Again. Again. Each strike reverberated through his bones. Sweat clung to his forehead despite the chill of the night. Dirt scattered across his shoes. His breath came heavy, almost frantic, but his movements were steady, methodical, as though he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head. From inside the house came a sound, a muffled cry. He froze, heart hammering. Emily. Her voice was faint, weak, but alive. David, please. The words were strangled, barely audible. They cut deeper than any accusation she had thrown at him hours earlier. For a moment he faltered. His grip on the shovel loosened. A flicker of doubt sliced through the fog of rage and desperation. He could stop. He could untie her, beg for forgiveness, salvage something from the wreckage of what they once called love. But then the image of her leaving flashed in his mind. Emily walking out, exposing him, taking everything with her. His debts, his shame, his failure. To David, her survival meant his ruin. The shovel struck the earth again, harder, faster, until the hole yawned wide beneath him, a shallow grave carved by trembling hands. He dragged her out, her wrists bound, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears and soil. Her muffled sobs pierced the night, but no one was near enough to hear. He couldn't look into her eyes for long. They reflected not just fear, but a kind of disbelief, as though she could not accept the man she had married was capable of this. "Don't fight it," he whispered, his voice low, trembling. "It'll be over soon." Emily thrashed weakly, her body frail from hours of struggle. David's hands shook as he forced her down into the pit, the earth cold against her skin. For a moment, he stood there, shovel in hand, staring at her face illuminated by moonlight. Tears blurred his vision, but his resolve hardened. One scoop of dirt, then another. The soil landed heavy across her chest, her arms, her legs. Each layer muffled her cries further, until only faint gasps slipped through the cracks of earth. Her eyes locked on his, pleading, accusing, refusing to close. And then, with the final heap of dirt, her face disappeared beneath the ground. David fell to his knees, chest heaving, staring at the disturbed earth. The silence was deafening. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he felt a strange calm creep into his veins. He whispered to himself again, "It's over. It's finally over." But the stillness carried something else too, a whisper he couldn't silence. The earth beneath him was not still. It seemed to shift, to breathe, to remember. He stumbled back toward the house, wiping the sweat and dirt from his skin, convincing himself that the world would accept his lie. Emily had left. She needed space. She wasn't coming back. Yet in the cold dawn, as neighbors began to stir and Claire's worry grew sharper, the disturbed soil glistened under the sun. It stood as a quiet witness to what David had done, and Claire would notice. The morning light spilled across the backyard, glinting against the damp soil. To most eyes it was nothing unusual, patches of earth shifted by the rain. But to Claire, Emily's younger sister, details had always mattered. And now, those details screamed louder than silence. For 2 days her calls to Emily had gone unanswered. At first, she told herself it was newlywed bliss, Emily taking time away, settling into marriage. But unease had a way of festering. By the 3rd day, worry had transformed into dread. She gripped her phone, staring at the unanswered messages. "Where are you? Call me back. Please, Em, I'm worried." No response. Not even the courtesy of a read receipt. That wasn't like her sister. Emily always replied. By noon, Claire drove to the house. The moment she stepped onto the porch, a weight pressed against her chest. The curtains were drawn, the air still. When David opened the door, his composure was the same as it had been on the phone. Too calm, too steady. "Claire," he said smoothly, forcing a half-smile. "You didn't need to come. Emily just needed space. She'll be back soon." Claire studied him. His shirt was crisp, his voice unshaken, but something in his eyes unsettled her. He looked like a man rehearsing his lines. 3 days without a word? She shot back. That's not Emily. She wouldn't do this to me. Or to Mom. David's smile faltered, but only for a second. You know how emotional she can get. She needed time. Claire stepped past him into the living room. The house was too clean, unnaturally tidy, as though scrubbed of any trace of a woman's presence. No mug on the counter, no shoes by the door. Her gaze swept the space, landing on the faint smell that lingered in the air. Not perfume, not food. Earth. Damp earth. Where's her phone? She asked sharply. David hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward the bedroom. She left it. Wanted distance, I guess. Claire's heart sank. Emily without her phone was unthinkable. It wasn't just absence, it was erasure. She wandered to the back door, David's steps echoing behind her. Outside, the yard stretched quiet, the trees bending in the autumn breeze. And there, near the edge of the garden, she saw it. A patch of dirt darker than the rest, unevenly pressed, the lines of a shovel barely concealed. Her stomach twisted. What's that? She asked, her voice tight. David didn't look. I replanted some flowers. Soil's still settling. But Claire's instincts screamed otherwise. The ground didn't look nurtured. It looked disturbed, as though something or someone had been hidden beneath. Her throat tightened. She turned back to him, searching his expression for cracks. His calmness was worse than anger. It wasn't the calm of peace, but the calm of a predator waiting to be unmasked. I want to talk to the police, she said finally, her voice trembling. David's jaw tensed, though his words remained smooth. There's no need for that, Claire. You'll only make things worse. But Claire wasn't convinced. As she walked back through the house, her hands shook, her pulse racing. Every instinct told her she was brushing against something dark, something she couldn't yet name. She left quickly, her footsteps echoing across the porch. Behind her, David stood in the doorway, watching. His expression didn't break, but his hand tightened against the doorframe until his knuckles turned white. Claire slid into her car, her eyes fixed on the house in the rearview mirror. The whispers of dread in her mind had turned into something louder now, a certainty that something terrible had happened. And somewhere beneath the soil of that backyard, Emily's story was still alive. Beneath the soil of the backyard, where silence pressed down heavier than stone, Emily opened her eyes. At first, there was only darkness, suffocating and absolute. Her chest constricted, every breath shallow, as though the air itself had been stolen from her. Then came the realization, the crushing weight above her, the stale taste of earth filling her mouth, the ropes digging into her wrists. Panic surged, primal and unrelenting. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the soil packed around her. Her mind reeled. This can't be real. I'm dreaming. I'm not underground. I'm not buried. But the rough edges of dirt against her skin told her otherwise. Her husband, her David, had put her here. She remembered flashes. The argument, his rage, the rope biting into her arms, his face contorted with something she had never seen before. And then, the shovel, the pit, the cold night air mixing with the scent of wet soil. She thrashed, the confined space pressing against her limbs. Each movement cost her precious oxygen, each gasp shallower than the last. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, louder than thought, louder than reason. No one knows I'm here. Claire doesn't know. Nobody will find me. For a moment, despair consumed her. Tears burned against her eyes, but there was no room to cry. She thought of her mother, of Claire, of the life she had barely begun to rebuild after marrying David. Had she ignored the signs? The secrecy, the late nights, the way his smile never reached his eyes anymore? Love had blinded her, and now love was burying her alive. But rage was stronger than grief. Rage clawed its way through her panic, igniting something in her chest. He wanted me gone. He thought he could silence me. He thought the earth could hold me. No, I will not die here. Her fingers curled, nails scraping against the soil. She pulled her arms upward, fighting the roan. Pes, twisting until the fibers tore into her skin. Pain flared, sharp and hot, but she welcomed it. It meant she was still alive. Her lungs begged for air as she dug, clawing tiny pockets around her face to breathe. The sound of her own heartbeat kept her going. Thud, thud. Proof of survival. Her mind drifted in fragments, flashing memories in between the suffocating darkness. David whispering, "It'll be over soon." The way he hadn't cried. The way he hadn't hesitated. That betrayal burned brighter than the suffocating earth pressing her down. She thought of Claire again, her sister's stubbornness, her refusal to ignore a wrong. If she could just last long enough, Claire would know. Claire always knew. Minutes passed like hours. Her chest tightened until she thought her ribs would snap. Black spots bloomed across her vision. Her hands moved slower, weaker, until finally, her wrist slipped free of the rope. The skin was raw, blood sticky against the dirt, but her hand was free. With desperate resolve, she clawed upward, scooping soil into the cramped space below her, making the smallest of tunnels. Each movement collapsed dirt back into her mouth, choking her, forcing her to spit and cough, losing air faster than she gained it. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Every handful of earth was a defiance, a message. "You will not bury me, David." Her body screamed for rest, but her mind screamed louder. Somewhere above, the faintest trickle of light seeped through a crack in the soil, so faint she thought she imagined it. She pushed harder, nails breaking, arms trembling, until her fingers brushed cool air. Hope exploded in her chest. She gasped, dragging her hand through, widening the crack. A sliver of night air kissed her fingertips, then her palm, then her face. She coughed violently, gulping the oxygen as if it were liquid. But freedom would not come all at once. She was till deep, still buried, still weak. Yet she had proof now the grave was not complete. She was not finished. Her body lay trembling in the dirt, exhaustion pulling at her, but her mind held on to a single thought. 3 days. If I keep fighting 3 days, someone will see. Someone will know. Above her, the soil shifted, carrying whispers of footsteps, the weight of David's calm presence moving through the house. She froze, heart pounding. He was close. Too close. She closed her eyes, forcing her breathing silent, her body still. For now, she would wait, conserve strength. Survival was not about fury alone. It was about patience. And when the time came, when her chance arrived, she would crawl out of this grave not just alive, but ready to face him. Claire had left David's house with her stomach twisted in knots, her mind replaying the sight of that uneven soil again and again. By the time she reached her car, the decision was already made. Her hands shook as she dialed the police. "My sister is missing," she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling but firm. "Her husband says she left, but she wouldn't just disappear like this. Something's wrong. I need someone to come." That call marked the beginning of what David would come to know as the unraveling. Within hours, 2 officers arrived at his door. David greeted them with the same steady smile he'd offered Claire, though a bead of sweat rolled unnoticed down his temple. "Your wife has been reported missing," one officer said. "We'd like to ask a few questions." David nodded calmly, even graciously. "Of course, I was expecting this." Emily, she can be impulsive. She wanted space after an argument. The officer's pen scratched against his notebook. "When exactly did she leave?" David hesitated only a fraction of a second. 3 nights ago, around midnight. Did she take her phone? No, she left it here. The officer raised his brow. Any luggage? David forced a chuckle. She's stubborn. Maybe some. David stared at it through the window, his hand tightening around the glass until it cracked in his palm. He told himself it was over, that no one could prove anything, that Emily was gone. But deep down, he knew the hunt had only just begun. The police report filed after Claire's call did more than open a missing persons case. It opened a door David had worked hard to keep sealed. Once investigators began pulling at the threads of his story, they found that the fabric of David and Emily's marriage was far from perfect. At first, it was little things. A neighbor mentioned overhearing raised voices late at night. A friend of Emily's admitted she had confided her unhappiness in recent months. And then came the most troubling detail. Emily had spoken, quietly but firmly, about leaving David for good. Detectives pressed Claire for everything she knew. She hesitated, torn between her sister's privacy and the urgency of the situation. Finally, she revealed the truth Emily had shared only with her. She told me she was planning to separate. She didn't want to be tied down to him anymore. She thought there might be someone else out there for her. The detectives exchanged looks. That gave them something tangible. Motive. Financial records only sharpened the picture. David, once a successful contractor, had been drowning under mounting debts. Bank statements showed maxed-out credit cards, overdue mortgage payments, and quiet withdrawals from Emily's personal account. He had been relying on her savings to stay afloat. If Emily truly intended to leave, David stood to lose not just his wife, but the financial lifeline that kept him from ruin. When confronted with these discoveries, David remained unshaken on the surface. Seated at the dining table, his hands folded neatly before him, he repeated the same refrain. Emily left. She's done this before. She'll come back when she's ready. His calmness might have fooled a stranger, but to the detectives it rang hollow. Every denial felt like a performance rehearsed too many times. Behind that composure, though, the pressure was mounting. Alone in the house after questioning, David would pace the living room in tight, anxious circles. He whispered to himself, trying to drown out the voices in his head, the accusing voices of Claire, the sharp questions of the police, the muffled memory of Emily's cries from beneath the soil. Each new revelation in the investigation spread like cracks through the image he was so desperate to protect. Family members began to turn. Even David's own relatives whispered doubts. Why had he not called the police immediately when Emily vanished? Why had he been so cold when others showed concern? The whispers grew louder when rumors of Emily's closeness to another man surfaced. A co-worker, Mark, admitted they had grown friendly, perhaps too friendly. He swore nothing had happened, but the possibility was enough to paint David in a darker light. The story now had all the elements of a tragedy: jealousy, betrayal, money, and a missing wife. David's mask began to slip. The calm husband who had greeted officers at his door was now short-tempered, snapping at questions, shutting out Claire entirely. When detectives asked to search the yard formally, his refusal was immediate and sharp. "You have no right. Unless you bring me a warrant, stay out of my property." That moment was telling. To the investigators, David was no longer just a husband waiting for his wife's return. He was a man guarding something, a man with too much to lose if the truth came to light. That night, Claire sat awake, haunted by the same thought. If Emily really had planned to leave, and if David knew it, what might he have done to keep her from walking away? The shadows of betrayal were growing dark, and soon they would lead the police back to the yard, the one place David swore they couldn't go. The whispers of betrayal that surrounded David's life were reaching the ears of police, neighbors, and family alike. Yet, as suspicion deepened above the ground, another story was unfolding below it, one that David believed had ended forever. Beneath the weight of damp soil, Emily's world had been reduced to darkness, pressure, and silence. At first, she thought she was dead. The suffocating blackness felt endless, and her body screamed with pain. But as moments bled into hours, something inside her refused to let go. The sharp sting of betrayal, her husband's hands shoveling dirt over her body, ignited a fire more powerful than fear. Her lungs burned as she gasped against the tiny pockets of air she had managed to create in the loose soil. Her fingers twitched, finding movement in the compacted earth. She clawed upward, inch by inch, though every scrape of her nails felt like fire tearing through her skin. The earth resisted her, pressing down as though eager to claim her again. The memory of David's face hovered in her mind, calm, deliberate, convinced she would never rise again. That image filled her with rage. If she surrendered, his lie would triumph. If she fought, she could rewrite the ending he had chosen for her. Minutes stretched into an eternity as her nails bent, broke, and bled. She pushed anyway, her hands trembling, her breaths shallow and desperate. Her body was weakening, yet her will hardened. She thought of her sister Claire, who would never stop looking. She thought of her life, ripped away too soon. And then she thought of David, how easily he had buried her, how sure he was that the dirt above her would silence her forever. That thought gave her strength. Finally, the soil shifted. A pocket of cold night air slipped through, brushing her face like salvation. She forced her arm upward until her hand broke the surface. The world outside was alive with wind and insects and the faint glow of moonlight. Summoning every last ounce of strength, Emily pulled herself upward, inch by inch, until her bloodied body spilled out onto the grass. She collapsed on the ground, gasping, the night air searing her lungs with icy freedom. Her body was bruised, her nails torn to shreds, her face streaked with dirt and blood. She was more ghost than woman, but she was alive. For a long moment she lay still, staring at the house in the distance. The windows glowed softly, hiding the man who believed he had won. A raw scream built in her chest, but she bit it back, choking it into silence. Screaming would waste strength. Screaming would alert him. She needed to move. Barefoot, she staggered forward. Each step was agony. Shards of gravel cut into her skin, and her muscles felt torn apart from within. But the fury inside her kept her upright. She did not walk like a victim, but like a revenant rising from her own grave. The world seemed unreal as she moved. Streetlights flickered in the distance. The wind rattled through the trees. Her mind wavered between clarity and delirium, but her goal was simple: survive long enough to find someone, anyone, who could help. At one point she collapsed against a fence, her hands trembling as she tried to climb over. The wood splinters stabbed her palms, but she pressed on. Every cut was another reminder that she was not finished. She would not allow David's silence to be her legacy. As she trudged along the deserted road, headlights suddenly appeared in the distance. She froze, her body swaying. Her heart pounded. The car slowed as it approached, then pulled to the side of the road. A middle-aged couple stepped out, horrified at the sight of the woman before them, half dead, covered in dirt and blood, her eyes burning with a fury that was almost inhuman. The woman rushed forward. "Oh my God, are you all right?" Emily's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, but her throat was raw from soil and screams swallowed underground. Finally, she rasped two words that chilled them both. "He buried me." The couple exchanged panicked glances, then scrambled to get her into the car. Emily collapsed against the seat, shivering uncontrollably, but her eyes remained open. She would not close them. Not until she had made it to safety. Not until David knew she was not gone. As the car sped toward the nearest hospital, Emily's thoughts blurred in and out of focus. But one truth cut through the haze. David had failed. She had clawed her way back from the grave, and now she would face him again, not as a victim, but as living proof of his betrayal. Somewhere back in that glowing house, David sat alone, convinced his nightmare was buried in the soil. But by dawn, the world would know. Emily was alive, and she was coming back. The hospital lights had been the first proof that Emily was still tethered to life. Doctors and nurses moved around her like shadows, stitching her wounds, hydrating her frail body, documenting her shocking ordeal. News of her survival spread quickly among police, who were already circling David's carefully crafted story. But David didn't know. He sat in his house as the world closed in, confident the lies he had spun would hold. By the time investigators arrived with a warrant, Emily had been whisked into protective custody. She had told them everything, every detail of the backyard, the suffocating soil, the betrayal in her husband's eyes. And yet, officers held the revelation close, waiting for the right moment to let the truth strike. That moment came 3 days later, in court. The preliminary hearing was meant to be routine. David had been arrested under suspicion of foul play after inconsistencies mounted. He walked into the courtroom wearing the same mask he had shown the world since Emily's disappearance, calm, collected, almost bored. He sat beside his attorney, hands folded neatly, eyes flickering only briefly toward Claire, who sat in the gallery. Her glare burned through him, but he didn't flinch. The judge called the court to order. The prosecutor began laying out the case: financial motives, marital strain, missing wife, disturbed soil in the yard. David listened, stone-faced. His attorney whispered reassurances, telling him the lack of a body meant no proof. David believed him. And then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. At first, the sound was small, just the echo of hesitant footsteps on polished floors. Heads turned, murmurs rippled across the room. Claire's hand shot to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Emily appeared. She walked slowly, each step deliberate, her frame still frail from the ordeal, but her presence undeniable. Dressed in modest hospital clothes beneath a borrowed coat, her hair fell around her dirt-streaked face like a halo of survival. The room froze, disbelief anchoring everyone in place. David's mask shattered. His lips parted, his eyes widened, and for the first time since Emily's disappearance, raw terror spilled across his face. He lurched forward as if struck, muttering incoherently. His attorney gripped his arm, whispering furiously, but David couldn't hear him. The courtroom no longer existed. There was only Emily, his ghost, his mistake, his wife, alive. Emily's gaze locked onto him, steady and unblinking. It wasn't just the look of a survivor, it was the look of judgment. For 3 endless seconds, silence ruled the room. Every eye darted between the husband in shock and the wife who had crawled out of her grave. Finally, the judge's gavel cracked against the bench, demanding order. Gasps, whispers, and shouts erupted all at once. Journalists scribbled frantically, attorneys stood gaping, and officers scrambled to restore control. David sank back in his seat, face ashen, the calm exterior he had clung to in ruins. He shook his head again and again, mouthing, "Whoa," ideas no one could hear. Impossible. Impossible. Emily walked past the rows of spectators, her bare feet sliding quietly in borrowed shoes. When she reached the prosecutor's table, she stopped and turned, facing David fully. Her voice, though hoarse, carried across the courtroom like a bell. "You buried me," she said. The room erupted again, but David only stared, his chest heaving. His mask was gone. In its place was the man he truly was, cornered, exposed, and terrified. The judge ordered recess, but the damage was irreversible. David's case, once balanced on the absence of a body, collapsed in an instant. The body was here, alive, breathing, staring him down with fury and pain. As officers moved to escort Emily safely from the courtroom, David remained frozen, his hands trembling on the table. He had thought he was untouchable, that his lies would bury her forever. But the woman he tried to erase had risen, and now the world knew. The trial would be no longer about suspicion. It would be about survival, betrayal, and justice. And for David, there was no escape. The courtroom had barely recovered from Emily's shocking reappearance when the questioning began again. This time, the calm facade David had once wielded like armor was gone. He sat hunched in the witness stand, his shoulders tight, his eyes darting toward Emily, and then away as if her stare might burn through him. The prosecutor leaned forward, voice steady but sharp. "Mr. Harris, your wife is alive. She has told us what happened that night. Are you prepared to explain why she was buried in your backyard?" David's throat bobbed as he swallowed. His attorney urged him to stay silent, to invoke his rights, but the pressure was unbearable. The eyes of the courtroom, Emily's eyes, were heavy on him, and the walls he had built to protect himself were crumbling. At first, he tried denial. I didn't bury her. She left. You have to believe me." His words stumbled over one another, thin and desperate. But the prosecutor pressed harder, bringing up the shovel found in the shed, the disturbed soil, the financial records. Piece by piece, the story David had clung to disintegrated. Finally, the dam broke. "Yes," his voice cracked, echoing through the hushed room. "Yes, I buried her." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but David continued, almost shouting now, the words spilling like poison he could no longer hold. "I didn't mean for it to go that far. You don't understand. She was going to leave me. After everything I gave her, everything I built for us, she wanted to walk away. I couldn't let her, not when I was already drowning." His attorney tried to silence him, but David shoved the hand away, eyes wild, voice shaking with fury and despair. "She was my last chance. Do you know what it's like to lose everything? The business, the house, the respect of everyone around you? She was supposed to stand by me, but instead, she—" His gaze snapped toward Emily, venom in his stare. "She betrayed me." Emily flinched but held her ground, her chin lifting in defiance. The prosecutor cut in, calm but relentless. "So you buried her alive to punish her? To silence her?" David's chest heaved. He rubbed his face with trembling hands, voice breaking now into sobs. "I thought she wouldn't suffer. I thought, if she was gone, it would be over. I told myself she didn't love me anymore, that she wanted someone else. And I—" He collapsed back in his seat, whispering hoarsely, "I just wanted the noise to stop." His confession, though twisted and fragmented, hung heavy in the courtroom. Half-truths mingled with self-justification, painting the portrait of a man consumed by his failures, blinded by pride and fear. For the first time, Claire felt a rush of vindication. His calm mask was gone, replaced by the raw truth of who he really was, weak, selfish, and dangerous. Emily sat motionless, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Her face was pale, but her eyes stayed fixed on David. He looked nothing like the man she had once loved. He looked like a stranger, unraveling before the world. The judge finally called for order, gavel striking sharply against the bench. Officers moved closer to David as his attorney sank into his seat, defeated. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the air heavy with shock. David's final words before being led away were a whisper, but they reached Emily all the same. "You were supposed to stay." Emily closed her eyes, steadying herself. When she opened them again, her gaze was cold and resolute. David's confession had given her what she needed. Truth laid bare, stripped of excuses. The trial was far from over, but his mask had shattered, his lies reduced to dust. And now, Justice could finally begin its course. The silence that followed David's broken confession was unlike any that had come before. It wasn't the tension of uncertainty or the anticipation of lies. It was the silence of truth exposed, heavy and undeniable. Yet the trial was not over. The court still needed to hear from the one person whose voice mattered most: Emily. When her name was called, the room shifted. All eyes turned toward her as she rose slowly from her seat. She looked fragile, her body still thin from the ordeal, her movements careful as though her bones ached with every step. But when she reached the witness stand, she carried herself with a quiet strength, a survivor refusing to be silenced again. After she was sworn in, the prosecutor asked her to recount her experience. Emily's voice trembled at first, raw from weeks of recovery, but soon steadied. "I remember the argument," she began, her eyes fixed not on David but on the judge ahead. "It wasn't the first. He was angry. He thought I was leaving him. And in truth, I was. I had to. I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Not with the fear, the control, the lies. I told him, and that was when everything changed." Her hands clenched together on the stand. "The next thing I knew, I woke up choking. Gee on dirt. It was cold. It was dark. I couldn't breathe. I realized I was underground, that he had buried me." Gasps echoed through the gallery, but Emily pressed on. Her voice sharpened, steadying with each word. "I screamed until my throat tore. I clawed until my nails bled. Every time I thought I couldn't keep going, I remembered his face. The calm way he looked at me before it all went black. That face told me I wasn't a person to him anymore. I was a problem to erase." Tears slid down her cheeks, but she did not falter. "I thought of my sister, of the life I still wanted, of everything I refused to let him take from me. That's what gave me the strength to push through the soil. That's why I'm here. Because I refused to let him decide the end of my story." The courtroom was silent except for muffled sobs from the gallery. Even the judge's expression softened under the weight of her testimony. Claire, seated behind Emily, pressed her hands to her lips, tears streaming freely. Emily's voice grew quieter now, but more resolute. "Surviving, it doesn't mean I'm free. Every night I wake up gasping for air, feeling the dirt pressing down again. I can't close my eyes without hearing the sound of his shovel. My hands still ache, my skin still burns. I survived, but part of me is still underground, still fighting. That is the price I live with every day." Her words hung in the air, a chilling reminder that survival is not the end of trauma. It is the beginning of learning to live with it. The prosecutor nodded solemnly and asked one final question. "Mrs. Harris, do you see the person who did this to you in this courtroom today?" Emily turned, her gaze locking on David. He shrank under her eyes, no longer the calm manipulator but a broken man exposed. "Yes," Emily said, her voice firm. "It was him. My husband." The statement was final, unflinching. The weight of her testimony pressed down on the room, leaving no room for doubt. The judge adjourned for the day, but no one moved immediately. The jurors' faces were pale, stricken by what they had heard. The spectators whispered Emily's name as though it belonged to both a woman and a miracle. As officers led David out in handcuffs, his head bowed low, Emily stepped down from the stand. Claire rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her sister with fierce relief. Emily closed her eyes briefly, leaning into the embrace. She had survived the grave, survived the courtroom, but the scars within would take a lifetime to heal. And as she walked out of the courtroom, the flash of cameras in her face, she understood the truth. Survival was not victory. Survival was endurance, a price she would carry forever. The trial reached its end with a verdict that seemed both inevitable and surreal. David Harris was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison. The words fell heavy in the courtroom, final and absolute. The gavel struck, echoing like the closing of a coffin, sealing David's fate within stone walls instead of earth. Yet as the crowd murmured, reporters scribbled, and officers escorted him away, Emily did not feel triumph. She did not feel the surge of victory that others seemed to expect. She felt only a deep, hollow ache, a wound that no sentence could fill. Justice had been served, yes, but justice could not undo the grave. The world outside the courthouse buzzed with cameras and microphones, a frenzy of questions hurled at her. How did you survive? What do you feel about the verdict? Do you forgive him? Emily answered none of them. She walked past the shouting voices, past the flashes of light, holding Claire's hand tightly. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. Days later, when the noise faded and the headlines shifted to other stories, Emily returned alone to the house she once shared with David. The property had been released back into her name, though she wasn't sure she wanted it. The place felt like a ghost of itself, each corner whispering of nights spent in love and nights drowned in arguments. But it was the backyard that called to her most. She stepped onto the grass slowly, the autumn wind brushing her face. The soil was different now, disturbed, dug up by police during their investigation. Still, she could see the patch where it had happened, where the ground had once held her captive. Emily crouched down, her fingers brushing the earth. The soil was cool, damp from a recent rain. She closed her eyes, hearing echoes of that night. David's shovel cutting into the ground, the suffocating silence when the last bit of light disappeared. Her own muffled cries swallowed by dirt. She shivered. The memories clung to her like shadows she could never shake. Justice had put David behind bars, but justice could not erase the betrayal of a husband's hands pressing the earth down over her. Justice could not silence the panic that woke her at night, the feeling that her lungs were filling with dirt all over again. She whispered into the wind, not sure if she was speaking to herself, to the earth, or to the ghost of the marriage she once believed in. I survived, but I'll never be the same. For a moment, she thought of David, not the monster who buried her, but the man she had once loved. She remembered laughter, plans for the future, small gestures of tenderness that now felt like lies. How had those hands, once gentle, become the tools of her undoing? The question had no answer, only silence. Emily stood again, brushing the dirt from her palms. The yard stretched behind her, ordinary to anyone else. But to her it would always be a graveyard, not of her body, but of her trust, her innocence, her old life. She turned to leave, pausing at the threshold of the house. The windows reflected her face back at her, tired but unbroken. She realized then that survival meant carrying both truths. She had beaten death, but she would always carry its mark. As the sun dipped low, the shadows of the house stretched long across the yard, swallowing the patch of soil where she had once lain. Emily watched the darkness spread and felt no fear, only recognition. The shadows were part of her now, companions she would live with forever. Justice had been served, but it was imperfect, incomplete. The court had sentenced David, but the price of truth was her burden to bear. Emily turned away from the backyard, away from the house, and walked into the fading light. Each step was heavy, but each step was hers alone. No longer bound to David, no longer silenced by the earth. She had risen from the grave. She had spoken the truth. And though the shadows followed, she would walk forward anyway. This chapter closes the cycle of betrayal, survival, and justice, ending not on David's downfall, but on Emily's haunting resilience. Would you like me to also create a short thematic epilogue paragraph, 150 to 200 words, summarizing the entire story like a true crime documentary ending?